Well, as Cara May mentioned, my name's Allison Fish, and yes, I run an aquaculture business. So every time I introduce myself, someone says, "Do you ever get the mention that your last name?" And I'm thinking, every single time I introduce myself, I get it. But it's I do feel like I found my family's calling. Perhaps we are a Cape Cod family, and maybe we were fishermen back in the day. Who knows? I am an SOM grad of 2008, so I'm coming up on my 5-year anniversary. Have a background before I came to SOM. I was in the food industry, but on the gourmet industry side, I ran restaurants in San Francisco. I worked in nonprofit fundraising for science education, pretty traditional SOM background, kind of all over the place, and then came here to really make that transition into how do I help grow green businesses? Specifically, I wanted to go work in corporate America and lead change from within the organization versus from the outside. That's what led me to DuPont, kind of a surprising outcome, not something I would have expected when I first came here to Yale. But it has been exactly what I'm looking for and has given me opportunities I never expected to have so quickly out of school, where I really am working with the daily challenges of how do you provide a more sustainable or a greener product to a consumer with less impact on the environment, better for their health, but still find a way to make money and get multinational organizations involved in NGO support and these kinds of things. And it's been a really fascinating journey. Been working with this business for about 3.5 years and was recently made the business director in August, so now get to have that full accountability for it, which is also another sort of interesting and exciting world to be in. But today I hope I can provide you a little bit more of the commercial perspective and some of the challenges you face in trying to reach these ideals or in just starting something like this so unique, both from a technology side, from within a corporation, but also on the marketing side. I mean, the consumers, as much as they preach they want these solutions, they want these offerings, they're not always necessarily willing to pay for them, or they're not always as well informed as you might hope, or they might be informed with misinformation. And so it becomes very much a complex challenge around education, communication. How do you build credibility? How do you build trust? How do you engage the consumers to get them to sort of, get that call to action so that they do actually begin to make purchasing behaviors that do benefit the overall environment and continue to promote these types of products in the future? So with that, I did put together a number of slides. I would ask that you guys be a little more interactive, or if things are interesting to you or you want to stop and talk about something in particular, we can go deeper. I might jump around a little bit, but I did want to give you sort of the overall overview of what is our offering, what's the business opportunity, what are the challenges around being within something like DuPont, but also partnering with a smaller company down in a developing country. And then moving on to there, what is really the market challenge and how do we convince people, or what are the different ways, or what are the things we're trying to overcome in order to make this a successful venture. So with that, this is kind of Verlis's mantra. I think all of you have been on our website, seen a couple of things, but we really believe there is a right way to do aquaculture, and that it needs to be part of the solution. I won't focus on feeding the world. I've been asked not to do that at all. But we do feel that there's not enough wild fish in the ocean, as many of you know, and therefore there is a need to figure out how to get aquaculture right. One of our sort of constant mantras or communications is that we're not perfect. Like, we've come out with a pretty comprehensive solution to some of aquaculture's challenges, but we also realize this is a journey and we've only come so far. There are many things that we believe we do really well, and there are some things we realize we still need to do a lot of work on. We have worked with some of the top NGOs around the country or around the world to identify our key priorities, and that's how we've really started and really focused our efforts to how we will begin this venture. But then it's a continuous journey, and there's some things that we've committed to for 2015, and we're always looking for that continuous improvement of what we can do next and what's really important. So that's where this commitment to adaptation and responsibility is what we believe produces our healthy and premium quality salmon. Verlis's farming practices are based on 3 main principles, just sort of at the highest level, and then we can go into whatever details you want in terms of how we raise our fish and what we think is important. But the number one thing for us is we believe healthy fish are the best tasting fish. And it's just, it seems to be proving itself right left and right. And so we believe good husbandry practices, taking care with the salmon, making sure they have the right nutrition, the right diet, getting good exercise, being grown in like clean and pristine environments. All these things are ways that we believe promote the health of the salmon, and therefore gives the consumer the best tasting salmon. And that's really how you can win them over, because at the end of the day, they really buy on taste and price, unfortunately. The second one is reducing impact on wild seafood populations. I know many of you have asked questions about our GM yeast and really the value proposition we bring around lowering that fish in fish out ratio, and we can go into some more details around that. But it's, you know, it's about the feeder fish, but it's also about protecting the wild salmon. We can't just, you know, keep consuming the wild salmon because we're going to run out. And then finally, protecting the areas where we farm. We farm down in Patagonia, one of the most beautiful places in the world. If you haven't had a chance to go, I highly recommend it. There are very few people, so very little interaction, but it's an ideal environment for salmon. The water temperatures are good, the waters are really deep. You're in an extreme environment where you've had lots of volcanoes and earthquakes, so you're in this fjord area where the waters get 80 meters deep, super close to the shore, and provide you this great sort of ability to have good tidal flow, the ability for the water to filter and nurture itself. You get 60%, I think 60% of the time of the year it rains, so you constantly get new water, plus you have, unfortunately, melting glaciers, but they're feeding the ocean as well. And it's an ideal environment for the salmon. So for us, given that we've chosen these places to farm, it's our responsibility to maintain and protect them as well. So that's really the guiding principles for everything that we do. Again, we're not perfect, so I'm sure you'll find flaws in our strategy and our philosophy, but just kind of wanted to set the tone. Harmoniously raised salmon, we believe, is a comprehensive solution. There are so many issues with aquaculture, and you can go on forever about it. We call our story sort of the yes and sort of story, because we always have more to tell. But the main principles or things we focused on is that fish in fish out ratio of how do we reduce the amount of feeder fish required in the salmon's diet and still provide healthy salmon. Number two, low pen densities. We believe that this is one way to provide a healthy environment for the salmon to grow in and have less impact on the areas where we farm. Now, having low pen densities doesn't mean we just go make more pens, and so you still have the same amount of biomass in one region. We're actually reducing the amount of biomass in a geographical region. As a result of low pen densities too, you've got just the salmon have a lot more room to swim, a lot more exercise. Our salmon are leaner, lower fat content than traditionally farmed salmon. That's in part due to the low pen densities, but also to the diet we've designed. Post-harvest fallowing is a super important part about protecting the ecosystems. After every harvest, our farms lie fallow for 3 to 6 months. They don't just lie fallow at our farm, they actually lie fallow also in a surrounding neighborhood, a geographical region. This allows the water, again, Mother Nature to take care of itself, nurture it, get the water flow, tidal flow going through. So it's important to protecting the areas where we farm, but also good for the salmon to, if there is a challenge or there is some disease outbreak or some bacteria, hopefully you give it a chance to sort of disappear or find someone else or some other animals to attach to. We use no hormones or preventive antibiotics. We use a naturally occurring beta carotene from Fafia. No copper anti-fouling on the nets. I don't know how familiar you guys are with some of this stuff, but just, it's a laundry list. For us, there isn't one solution, there isn't one problem. It's how do we look at all the challenges for aquaculture and try to address the most important ones today, and then commit to that continuous improvement. At the end of the day, premium care means great tasting salmon. And then we also know that this is not an easy sell. It's a complex story for us to tell, and it's an even more complex story for our customers to tell. So then it becomes this, how do we support that? How do we educate the consumer? How do we provide materials and videos and POS material or point of sale material to help our customers sell the product? Because if we don't sell the product, we're not going to reach our sustainability goals. If we are a niche market, we're not actually preserving any feeder fish. We're not actually benefiting anyone by being a small market that's only serving 100 people a night or whatnot. And coming from a high-end restaurant background, that was something I really grappled with, like sort of this idea that there was precious food and there was food that was good for the masses. And this idea of if you make a small or even medium-sized improvement to an industrialized food system, you can have so much more impact than if you start. This is my perspective. I agree. Sorry that I don't want to force my opinions on anyone, but the idea is that you can actually have so much more impact than if you start a small company that's feeding 100 people a week or 100 people a day. But it was something I personally had to grapple with for a long time. Finally, we can't do this alone. We need the support and the credibility of the environmental community, and that's something that we've worked with since the beginning of our inception. So,
Allison?
Yeah.
Just a couple
Sure.
questions. Excuse my ignorance, but the Pfaffia, number 4, what is that? That's
Pfaffia.
Color, right?
Yeah, so it's a natural coloring. It's a naturally occurring beta carotene in the wild. And it's actually, I believe, a yeast is its actual makeup. But it's what we put in the diet to provide the antioxidant and the beta carotene.
Cool. And then could you break down in the customer sales, what percent would be restaurant customers versus supermarkets versus
Sure.
small?
And I have a map later on that shows you who they all are,
Perfect.
like in terms of our regional distribution. But right now we're about 50-50, food service versus retail. And we'll talk about that sort of go-to-market strategy in a little bit. There was a lot of surprises that we encountered from when we started versus where we are today. The true Verlis so different. So it's really this fish in, fish out ratio that's really unique to us. Anyone else can do any of those things that we listed on there. The only thing no one else can do is get the fish in, fish out ratio down to 1-to-1. I'm going to spend 2 minutes on what the fish in, fish out ratio is, just so everyone kind of has a basic understanding. Salmon don't make their own omega-3s. They get it in their diet just like we do. Salmon need a certain level of omega-3s for a strong immune system. Historically, those omega-3s have come from feeder fish. So the small oily fish, herring, anchovies, mackerel, in order to provide them with the omega-3s. Now, in traditionally farmed salmon, it takes roughly 4 pounds of feeder fish to raise 1 pound of salmon. Ultimately, a really bad use of resources if you think about what goes in versus what goes out. And the reason it takes so many feeder fish, it's not because of the fish meal, it's not because of the protein, it's because of the oil. It's all about those omega-3s. So you can have a fish in, fish out ratio of 1-to-1 from the protein perspective, but if you're looking at the oil perspective, that's when you get into the 4-to-1 ratio. And so what they do is they harvest 4 pounds of feeder fish, extract the fish oil, put it in the diet, and then, of course, the rest of it goes to other uses, perhaps, chicken farms or whatnot. But at the end of the day, they still had to take 4 pounds of feeder fish out to get enough oil to feed the salmon, to give them a strong enough nutritional diet for their well-being. This has been one of the biggest challenges of the industry. There aren't a lot of omega-3 resources out there. And if you look at, the Monterey Bay Aquarium's website, or if you look at WWF, one of their top complaints about aquaculture is the feeder fish or wild fish in the feed for salmon. So this is something we have been able to achieve by replacing 75% of our feeder fish in the diet, or the oil from the feeder fish, with an omega-3 rich yeast. Yes, this is a genetically modified yeast, and we'll go into some details around that. But it's something that we feel it truly is offering a solution to an environmental challenge that no one else has been able to find. You can look at flaxseed, you can look at algae, you can look at all these other sources of omega-3s, but none of them are as efficient or effective as the omega-3 rich yeast that we've been able to come up with. And one of the questions that came up from you guys on Tuesday was, is this a proprietary yeast? And it is. This is something that DuPont developed, and it's something that we are the only ones, we believe, who can reach these targets, and it's definitely our main differentiation and a competitive advantage. Again, it's not our only advantage, because we have a whole complete solution and believe the whole package is what's important, but it is something no one else can copy, or at least would take a long time for them to copy. Yeah?
Can I follow up on that? I'm wondering if you can talk about the degree of efficiency and effectiveness of the yeast over other sources.
I don't have that information at the top of my head, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
The second follow-up, I'm wondering if you can give any background on where the idea for this
Yeast came from?
Yeah,
Sure. Sure. I'm not sure where the original idea came from. I would say DuPont has a really strong innovation engine, and they all have a very large CR&D group. So folks, central research and development, they're like crazy mad scientists where they're just trying to come up with new stuff. That's how they came up with nylon. That's how they came up with Tyvek, or all the things that they come up with. They're like artists. They get very engaged in something and they just take it to its fullest, creative outlook. So they started with, biotechnology about 25 years ago, and this was just something that they were able to discover some opportunities around. It was about 10 years of work to develop this yeast, and they're still working on developing better, more efficient versions of the yeast. The essence of it came originally from an algae, so we gave the omega-3 making capability from algae to a yeast. And that's where the actual modification happened. And then we ferment the yeast just like you would ferment any yeast from used in bread or used in beer or whatnot. So you add sugar and water and just ferment it in large tanks.
Are there other uses for it?
Right now, no. This is the only one. We did originally the first program that was launched with this technology was a human supplement. So you know how fish oil is this huge rage and everyone's taking supplements. We offered a vegan fish oil, essentially, or a vegan omega-3 tablet. But unfortunately, I think our cost position was probably out of proportion with the marketplace. And also ours is an EPA omega-3 versus a DHA. And right now, most people are familiar with DHA as an omega-3 and its benefits. The EPA story hasn't quite reached consumers yet, but I would say that's probably, we might have been just too early in front of our time. The pharmaceutical interest is really interested in pure EPA. So the fact that we have this capability, we are exploring opportunities in that because there's a lot of heart health benefits around it. And then there's lots of ideas around pet food and various other food supplements and these kinds of things, but the applications haven't been fully explored. If you look at where the omega-3s go in the marketplace, I believe 60% of them are used by the aquaculture industry, and so that's why this was one of the top priorities of focusing on it. Plus, it was one of the biggest concerns because it was a poor use of resources. Yeah?
What's your position on selling and licensing out yeast to other companies?
We currently are, and I'll talk about our partner in a minute, but we're currently in an exclusive for the Americas with our partner. And so we're going to stick with them for a little while. It's taking quite a bit of investment. I'll talk a little bit about the business model, why we chose this partner, why we chose the model that we did, because it's important to look a little at the value chain and understand where you can capture the most value. But that might be something we do in the future. We've also considered licensing out the whole harmoniously raised concept. Is that something where if people met all of these criteria that we've established to be what Verlis harmoniously raised means, can they use the branding and the position that equity that we develop over time in order to promote their product? But it's, there's lots of unknowns in that future. We got to get this one down right first. Good? Okay. So why does it matter? Why does fish in, fish out matter? It matters because according to the FAO, we've harvested about 70% of fish populations over or at sustainable levels, mostly depleted and exploited. There's a maximum amount of feeder fish we can take out of the ocean every year, and we reached those numbers in the late 90s. So in the late 90s, we started taking out a certain amount of feeder fish. They are very well managed fisheries out of Peru and Chile and out of Scandinavia, but we've kind of maxed out what we can take out of the water in terms of feeder fish, and that number doesn't fluctuate from year to year. At the same time, the salmon industry goes up 7 to 10% a year. So the demand continues to increase for the omega-3s. Think about the fish oil supplement industry. That's just gone through the roof. And now if pharmaceutical industries are also looking at this as a major resource, it's a problem. There aren't enough omega-3s available in the marketplace. So we needed to find alternative solutions. If you didn't find alternatives to the omega-3s, you could reduce the omega-3s in the diet. Like you could just not put as much fish oil in the diet, substitute it with vegetable oil, but then you're going to compromise the immune system of the salmon and potentially open yourself up to more disease and risk given some of the circumstances. As I said, omega-3s continue to be a consumer focus and as we focus on wellness and health. And then at the end of the day, we can't take more feeder fish out of the ocean because they play such an important role in the food chain, right? So there's this whole idea of how do you pass energy through the food chain, and it starts with the phytoplankton and moves up through the food chain until you get to the salmon. And by taking the feeder fish out of that important role, it really breaks up that system and can significantly hurt the biodiversity of the areas. So while we do all these wonderful things, and what we believe good things around aquaculture, at the end of the day, the consumer really cares about taste, or you might say the buyer really cares about taste. That's where we're really getting persistence back. So we just continuously have to come back to flavor, profile, taste. And it's such a weird dichotomy of a world to live in where you're promoting this sort of ecological story, this health story, but at the end of the day, it's an experience. You're eating the salmon. You're enjoying the salmon, and I'll talk a little bit more about the food craze in this country and how that really sort of adds noise to the conversation and makes it a little bit harder of a sell. So, partnership opportunity and challenges. So I'm going to switch gears a little and go into the business perspective and talk some about the partnership. So salmon aquaculture opportunity. Global farm salmon markets are about 1.4 million metric tons around the world. That's about a $14 billion business. And the US alone, you're looking at a $4.5 billion market opportunity. That's for the total salmon market. If you look at the farm salmon, it's only about $3 billion. And this continues to grow 7 to 10% a year. Right now, if you look at the salmon breakup, it's about 40% wild, 60% farmed. And as you all know, you can't take out any more wild salmon than you already are. Though there's a lot of new stuff happening around ranching. Has anyone ever heard of ranching wild salmon, where you keep them until a certain age and then you release them into the wild later in life? So it's kind of a half farming hybrid situation. Key market trends, there's a commoditization of traditionally farmed salmon. People are starting to say, I want to know where my food comes from. How is it raised? Is it good for me? Is it good for the environment? Now that size of how many consumers really care about that is still a little bit unknown, or whether or not they're willing to make significant changes to their purchasing behaviors is unknown, but we're trying to focus on that. Sustainable seafood and traceability. Started with produce, went to meat, went to dairy. Seafood's kind of the last frontier. Is this something that consumers really want to focus on? Do they want sustainable options? Do they care about it? Do they want to do enough research to understand it? Do they want to farm that decision out to people like the Monterey Bay Aquarium or to Whole Foods? You know, what are their choices? How do they use eco labels? All these things, because seafood's pretty complex. And given that every single species is different, and whether it's wild versus farmed, you're looking at different issues, different challenges, and the consumer, to be honest, doesn't have the time or the real patience to dive into those details. Traceability, that's been a huge trend, particularly in the seafood industry. There's been a lot of articles recently about 60% mislabeling happening out there in the marketplace. So you don't even know what you're eating. So I guess you could say, well, at least they're labeling, but if they're labeling wrong, is that really a benefit? But it is something that we try to address through some of the materials that we've developed. And then consumer focus on antibiotics. There's a general stigma that if an animal needs antibiotics, there's something wrong with it, whether there's something wrong with your farming practice or you're compromising their health in some way, shape, or form. And so there's just a general negative feeling about antibiotics, even though if they had children and their child got sick, they would probably feed them antibiotics without thinking about it. So it's an interesting discussion to have, and as you explore the details around farming, you can learn a lot more about, how difficult these decisions might be. Because if our fish do get sick, there is an animal welfare law that sort of forces us to feed them antibiotics. So something that we have to address. The salmon industry is not very diversified. I would say there's some big players around the world: Marine Harvest, Multi-Export, Cermaq, Leroy, most of them Norwegian companies that then expanded to other parts of the world. The Chilean industry itself was probably mostly started by Norwegian farmers and has been really fully exploited by Norwegian farmers. But there are a couple of local groups like AquaChile, which is one of the ones that we work with down there, that have really led the charge on being entrepreneurs and growing a very young, it's only about a 25, 26-year-old industry down in the Patagonia region. The latest thing has been premium salmon, and people who are really trying to differentiate themselves. Branding is not normal in seafood. I don't know if many of you have noticed, but you don't go to a seafood counter and ask for particular brands of cod or swordfish. It's just swordfish. It's the only option you have, well, if there is swordfish. But halibut, or you might have Alaskan halibut, but it's a regional branding. There's not actually a company branding. And so what's been interesting on this journey is that when people say to me, well, isn't farm salmon bad? And I say to them, well, it depends on the farmer. They say, well, I don't know who the farmer is. And that sort of leads to a whole new questions. Of course you don't, because we haven't gotten that far in this business or in this industry. And so this is a whole new territory for this industry to mark on. And we don't know if it's going to be important or not. We found that organic has actually taken a pretty decent hold on some consumers, and that's just because they have a positive affinity with organic, even though it means absolutely nothing in seafood. There's no international standard for organic seafood today. There's 13 different European standards, and I'm not really, they don't align at all. So there's a couple, consistencies throughout the standards, but they're not relevant. But because a consumer is comfortable with the word, they're willing to pay more for it. And they just feel like, oh, it must be good. So that's something that has been interesting in our learning as well. But a couple things, you guys watched the Lac du Art video. Hope you enjoyed David Suzuki's attack on Lac du Art. Schooner Bay is a recent brand that came out. Interesting concept. They promote themselves as being very sustainable. If you look at them, they've actually haven't changed their practices at all. They're owned by Grieg, which is a pretty big supplier of salmon or producer of salmon. And the only thing they've done is they've taken the top 6% of their production and branded it Schooner Bay. And they've said this is a better salmon. But then they try to support it with sustainability claims, and you're like, but you haven't improved anything. You haven't really changed anything. So it's an interesting concept to see how marketing can be really strong without really a story to back it up. It can be splashy, it can be engaging, and they're getting all the chefs on board, and it's all about this sort of premium quality. Or if you think about wine, it's like the premier grapes, it's the premier salmon. Then recently, and you guys, a couple of you brought this up as well, is there's the land-based farming that's coming. This is something that's coming. It's not here yet. There's very small farms around the world right now that are testing it out. And there's a lot of unknowns out there. Economics, carbon footprint, health of the salmon. There's, they're packing them in like crazy. But there's a lot of great things where you don't have any impact on the ocean. You don't have any impact on the ecosystem. So there's a lot of pros and cons, and I think as we learn more about that opportunity, we'll have to see what makes sense in the long run. It's not like we have a ton of land to be provided for this as well. There's some land issues coming up in the world too. So there's just there's so many things to think about. There's so many dynamics and trade-offs to consider in these types of business decisions, and even in developing what you're doing and how you're going to try and do it. It becomes super complex very, very quickly. Yeah?
Just about the antibiotics piece. If I were a mother giving my child an antibiotic, then I would go to the doctor, and the doctor would say, you should have this antibiotic,
Yep.
and this is what your child needs. And I would guess that the fear about eating salmon antibiotic is the doctor hasn't told me that this is the antibiotic that I need, and I don't know if it's going to be good for me or bad for me or what the effect is. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about testing on humans of the antibiotics that you did?
So just so everyone knows, if you feed your salmon antibiotics, you have to wait, by law in the US, I think you have to wait 4 to 6 weeks until you can harvest that fish. And they do test the fish to make sure there's no residue left in the salmon flesh at all. So there would be no antibiotics remaining in the meat itself, and there never can be. Now, I would say, based on what I've been reading lately as a consumer, I may or may not be confident that my fish have been tested. I mean, the USDA and FDA or whatever have not done a good job of testing fish that have come into this country from other parts of the world. So, of course, it's a reasonable risk. But for us, it is definitely what we do. We do not feed our salmon antibiotics unless a veterinarian tells us we have to, and that there is a disease identified. We have veterinarians come out to our farms every week and spend time with the salmon. They watch the salmon, they test the salmon, they monitor the salmon. And it's, for us, it's part of our value proposition. I think one of the bigger concerns about antibiotics from an environmental perspective, and I apologize, I don't know all the details, but I think it's the impact of the waste going into the ocean. So the waste from the fish carrying that antibiotic, and then the fear of creating a resistance, antibiotic resistance in the environment, is just a general greater fear. I would say there are a lot of rules around which antibiotics you're allowed to use in salmon and which are not. Some countries have better regulation than others. But if you look at some of the standards that are being developed by NGOs, they're trying to find ways to standardize. They're not saying no antibiotics, but they're saying putting provisions around how they're used or which ones are used, and the different ways that they are fed to the salmon. So those are the types of things they're trying to control or put some controls around to understand really the true implications of the antibiotic use. But for the most part, there really isn't a prophylactic use of antibiotics. There's no benefit to having salmon just fed antibiotics for no reason. It's actually really expensive. Doesn't make sense. So, as you all know, I work for DuPont, and what's really fun is that what we make is yeast. We make biomass. It looks like fish feed, actually. Comes from the algae, as I mentioned. But what we sell is salmon, and it's just a very different discussion, and it's a different way of doing business, to work with a downstream business partner and invest your time in their success, benefiting from their success as well. But it's a very unique way of doing business, and I would say most people in my company are still not comfortable with it. And feel like there's a lot of risk about being involved even in that relationship downstream. I would say, yes, we sell salmon, but again, we're selling an idea, we're selling an experience. It's gourmet, it's, whatever. It's whatever your relationship is to food, but it's an emotional thing. It's not just a technical thing. It's not just an environmental thing. Now you look like you're staring at, what is that? A poached egg? Poached egg with salmon and yeah. I have to admit, this is where my food background in San Francisco actually has come in handy quite a bit, is to learn how to talk this language versus just the technical aspect of GM yeast. You might think, why DuPont? DuPont doesn't seem like a good fit, but they do have good intentions. They're just not salmon farmers, so we really had to look for a partner to figure out how to make this technology accessible for a good purpose and a good cause. But just for sort of quick background, I don't know how many of you, what you all think of DuPont. You probably think of the chemical giants, or you probably think of, I don't know, paint, something like that. That's what I thought about. But there are three main mega trends and focus areas of the company, and sort of how we're driving our portfolio today is around feeding the world, reducing dependency on fossil fuels, and keeping people and the environment safe. So if you looked at our portfolio of products, I think we're about 30 to 40% food now, food and nutrition, which no one would ever consider or think about historically. Energy, there's a lot of work on biofuels, cellulosic biofuels. There's a lot of work on, photovoltaics, which is not doing so great these days. But then there's also a lot of just material, how do we get lightweight materials that are not using petroleum as their baseline, and also provide give our customers the ability to reduce their dependency on fossil fuels. So we work with Toyota and give them lighter materials to use in their Priuses or in their cars, or these kinds of things to help benefit that cause. And then finally, protecting people and the environment, and there's a number of things on that sense, but Century glass, Kevlar, these kinds of things, sort of flame retardant materials that protect lives and the environment. Yeah.
What other kinds of food enterprises does DuPont work on?
So about 2 years ago, we bought Danisco. I don't know if you're familiar with Danisco. They're a Danish company. They do a lot of enzymes, food enzymes. And so they're in the baking industry, the yogurt industry, the beer industry. And I'm still learning about it as well. But I would say that would be probably 10% of our food ingredients today. Then we do have a crop business called Pioneer, which is genetically modified crops, but it is something that is huge for us as well. And then we have salmon, which is tiny, like this big, but it is a growing part of our focus. We also do a lot of food safety testing. So we have a lot of things that test E. coli, a lot of programs that, that are being used in developing countries to ensure that the food that is being delivered is safe and free of disease. But it is definitely a growing part of our company. I encourage you to check out the website because I'm probably not doing it as much justice as I should. We're really diversified, and sometimes it gets very confusing to understand where we're playing and where we're not playing. And I work there, which is, I can't imagine what it's like to be on the outside. Partnership. So, as I mentioned, DuPont's not a farmer. They know nothing about salmon farming, and so we had to find someone that we could work with. And I'll talk a little bit about how we went out with the yeast initially to talk to stakeholders and do some consumer research. But at the end of the day, we ended up finding a partner down in Chile called AquaChile, and I just kind of wanted to highlight some of the difficulties or challenges or even differences between the two companies and what they were trying to achieve. Here you have, we're not in a joint venture, so we act like a joint venture, but we're not legally bound, or there's not an LLC. What we're doing is a joint development agreement. So it's I don't know if it's a 10 to 15 year agreement with specific geographical region focus and with particular roles and responsibilities of each of the partners. But imagine you've got this 211-year-old company coming in and talking to this 30-year-old company, and you've got DuPont in Wilmington, Delaware. It's been around forever. It's sort of the old established guard, and then you've got this very entrepreneurial startup mindset of a small company down in Chile. I don't know if you guys have ever been down to Chile, but it's, salmon industry is actually one of the largest industries for the country, but there's very few people in Chile. So it's a very startup, small, let's, make things happen kind of environment. Whereas at DuPont, we're 75,000 people across 60 or 48 countries, and we move a little slower. It takes a little while for us to make decisions, and we're really data driven, we're engineering driven. It's all about, sort of being very sure about any decision you make, where they kind of fly by the seat of their pants. So bringing these two cultures together and creating a new organization that's trying to solve some of these big challenges has been super difficult. Other differences would be, there were commodity sales focused industry, commodity salmon. A lot of the products DuPont brings are premium value. They're at the higher end of the spectrum. It's a different conversation with in your sales targets or in your go-to-market strategy. Financially, significant difference. You've got a $500 million company versus a $38 billion company. You had a different relationship to nonprofit organizations. DuPont has been working with the environmental NGO community for the last 20 years. It started off early years with compliance, but then moved into how do we think about new solutions to address some of these big problems. Whereas AquaChile, so I'm sorry, back to DuPont, we actually often sit at the table with the NGO community, and we sit down and we talk to them about what are ways we can explore, work together to come up with these ideas. I actually found DuPont through one of those opportunities. I worked at EDF when I was here at school. I did my internship at EDF, and they were working with DuPont at the time on some nanotechnology risk assessment tools. So to me, that was my first introduction to them, was through the NGO community. So there, very established relationships with multi-stakeholders. When we first started working with AquaChile, they didn't want to talk to the NGOs. The NGOs were their worst enemy. They were being attacked weekly by NGOs. So how could you even consider having a relationship with them, let alone collaborating with them to come up with how we were going to raise our salmon? And that's exactly what we ended up doing, but it was a push and a pull and a give and a take and all kinds of things. So it's definitely being, having technology is great and having solutions is wonderful. How you find ways to get them to market can be really challenging and different, and how you find the capabilities at different organizations and bring different cultures together to be successful just goes along for the complexity of the whole thing. Any questions about the partnership? Nope. So this is a little bit about the value chain. I don't know how many of you know the salmon value chain, but if you think about it, I think about it from the omega-3 producers, I'm sorry, but that's the grounding starting point. But that omega-3 then goes to the fish feed producers. The fish feed producers sell fish feed to the fish farmers, and then the fish farmers sell to the retailers, the distributors, and the restaurants, and then that's down to the consumer or the end user, or you guys. If you look at most of these markets, they're all commodity. This is commodity, this is commodity. But there's a lot of value to be captured between this transition as well as this transition. Now, DuPont knew they couldn't come here. They did try that with the human supplement, but wasn't able to reach that. But this is really where some value could be captured. But it encouraged us to create a unique business model where we skipped over the fish feed producers. Because most of the time DuPont is a material or an ingredient provider, and they just sell directly to the producers and then don't really know how it gets used down chain at all. But because there was not a lot of, all these markets were commodity and our technology was still pretty high value and actually, to be honest, not cheap, we had to find a different way to make it a profitable opportunity or venture for both business partners. And that's how we chose to go downstream and work with the fish farmer, invest in branding a salmon product and bringing that to market. If you look at how we split our work, DuPont develops and supplies the omega-3 biomass. Aquachili does pay us for the biomass to help mitigate the risk. I'm sorry, and I'm skipping, I guess I skipped a line here. Together we define how we're going to raise this product. Like, we defined what our value proposition is going to be, what are the different practices we were going to incorporate, and engaged the experts to help define that. But Aquachili is required or is responsible for the raising of the salmon. So they own the operations and the management of the farms. And there's a lot of sort of risk involved in that. We don't have the daily reporting or vision or access to what's going on at the farms. And sometimes there's some things that come up that you're like, how come you didn't tell us sooner? How come we didn't know that there were some issues sooner than this, or that we had to feed them antibiotics? We find out 4 weeks later, and it can be a little bit alarming and concerning, and you have to figure out how do you bring, again, those two cultures together, two norms and practices to come up with something that's comfortable for both parties so that you can really achieve the goals that you've set out for yourselves. Together, we partner on marketing and the selling of Verlasso, and then that results in we share the premium value of the Verlasso premium as well. So it's very unusual business model. Like I said, without being a JV, it becomes a little bit more complicated because we don't have a separate legal entity, but it works well from a lot of levels. And by us being able to work with Aquachili actually owns the brand. We've given them the brand. They own the salmon. They own that sort of whole distribution aspect of it. And we see ourselves as co-marketers. This gives us a lot of leeway when you're coming from a company like DuPont, who has very strict branding guidelines. And if we hadn't done this, if it had been a DuPont brand or a co-owned brand, we'd have to have that silly oval, DuPont oval, all over the place. And to be honest, if you're trying to sell salmon, the last thing you want to lead with is the DuPont oval. Now, don't get me wrong, we don't hide that from our customers. We do talk about DuPont's role. We do talk about the yeast. We talk about the GM yeast. But you don't want to be leading into that conversation with it. You don't want to have this lovely little fish with a red circle around it and DuPont through the middle. It's not going to work at a consumer level. It's not going to work at a B2B level as well. And I would say that today no one thinks of DuPont as a food company. We did buy Danisco 2 years ago, and I believe in 5-10 years people will think of DuPont as a food company. And at some point these will meet up and we can then leverage that a little bit more. But today it doesn't make sense. If we want this to succeed, we have to establish our own personality, our own values, our own ethics in order to really to drive the story forward and to get people to engage. Because as much as let's see, how do I express this? There's an anti-corporate movement out there. We've all been involved in it or have thought about it. And DuPont's probably there's not enough information out there, so people don't really understand what DuPont's trying to do. And I can't say everything that DuPont's done or does is good, and I don't agree with everything they do either. So I get and understand the association could have negative effect. But I do believe that what Verlasso's doing is valuable and important, and it couldn't have been done without DuPont's backing, without their technology and innovation, and without their vision. So it is still a very important part of this business venture. Thoughts, comments? Yeah? No.
Focus of the conversation today, but I'm interested in your experience architecting this venture. deal between
It's an ongoing process, I would say. That has many stages. So we had like the development phase, and now we're in the startup phase. Then we had the startup phase, and now we're in the scale-up phase, and then there's a post-scale-up phase. And it's been, it's an ongoing negotiation, and we're always trying to outweigh risks and rewards for both partners. You're kind of bringing the different things to the table. We have to realize we couldn't have come to market without them. They had an established business in the aquaculture industry, and they were doing very well. They were one of the, I think they were the second largest supplier of salmon to the United States. So for them, they didn't need us, but they did see the future in this technology and this innovation, and the market research that we brought, they saw the business opportunity as well. So in the beginning, I think the risk was heavily weighed on our part because it was us kind of bringing this forward. But as time moves on, it's shifting. And so but it is a constant negotiation, because as you're starting new technologies, things don't always work out the way you think they are. Like, yes, we make the biomass and they pay for it, but that price of biomass is, when we had those droughts this year with corn, our sugar prices went up significantly, and again, things changed. And so you have to constantly negotiate and rebalance the risk-reward discussion. So it becomes a little bit complex. Is that kind of what you were looking for? I don't know if I would say that most people in the industry weren't interested. When we first approached them, they thought it was too risky. So they didn't think a branded fish would work. They didn't think that consumers would care. And I don't know, it was too great of a risk for them to consider. But Aqua Chile has always been seen as a forward-thinking, progressive-thinking salmon farmer, and the CEO himself saw the opportunity, and he does sit on our board to help sort of guide our business direction and instruction. Yeah?
So how do the costs compare between the yeast and
Fish oil?
Yeah.
Significant difference. I would say today the cost is not, there's no balance. We are able to produce a pretty high omega-3 level yeast, but we couldn't just be a substitute. Otherwise, it would be a very different business model, and that's partially why we look to how do we create value down or capture value down the chain. We do believe we can bring the cost down over time, but when you're talking about such a new idea, and you're doing it at still a very small scale, it's hard to get some of those economies of scale. So that's something we'll hope to do in the future, because our ultimate goal is to have a more broadly available salmon.
So are you talking like multiples, order of magnitude, multiple orders of magnitude, like what?
Multiples. Yeah. Sorry, I can't really reveal too much on the cost, but I would say that there's just not, at this point there's no discussion. I would say as the demand goes up for fish oil, the price of fish oil will continue to increase, and that will definitely shift the dynamics. We're also continuously improving our cell line, so we're getting higher and higher levels of omega-3s, which means we can use less and less in the feed and still have maintain the high levels of omega-3s in the salmon. So we're looking at improving the product efficiency, bringing down the cost, as well as waiting for fish oil to continue to go up. Yeah?
Are there international regulations or trade agreements on the harvesting of feeder fish, and do you foresee any kind of like market-based agreements in the future coming into play that would shift things more towards your business succeeding?
Well, as I mentioned before, they're very well managed fisheries, and there are, and I'm sorry, I don't know if you guys noticed, but I'm pregnant, and I have a little bit of pregnant brain going on. I don't always remember the words I'm trying to think of, but there are maximum harvest levels, and we have maxed those out. So yes, those regulations significantly inform the availability of feeder fish. And some of the reaction, so the response to limited feeder fish is the price goes up, and so then the reaction from the fish farmers often is reduce the amount of fish oil in the diet and then supplement it with vegetable oil. And that's when you're going to get just a very different quality fish, and also you put them at risk for disease. Now, in terms of marketing, what did you say? Are there any marketing?
Just asking about the future, like what kinds of agreements might come online, or taxes, financial disincentives
I don't know.
to continue overfishing.
I don't know, because it's all run by countries. There isn't a lot of international collaboration around that yet, and Peru gets to set its harvest levels. Chile gets to set its harvest levels. And there isn't actually a certification for feeder fish either in terms of there's not like an MS. Hi. Did I do that? There's not, Marine Stewardship Council is the wild fisheries certification. They don't even certify feeder fish yet. So once that comes into play, then it could be another different discussion on there could be adjusted harvest levels or whatnot. I do know that the Peruvian fishery just reduced its harvest level for the year, so we're expecting prices to go up this year. Will it be maintained or sustained? Not sure, because it has been shown that for wild fisheries, if you stop harvesting or reduce harvesting significantly for a period of time, the fisheries do come back. I mean, in general, they will bring themselves back, but it just depends on how long you give it to rejuvenate. I don't think it will ever get much larger than it currently is, and then there's still just so much uncontrolled fishing happening across the globe in sort of open ocean space anyway, so it's kind of uncertain. Yes.
We have to wait for it to cool and then it will turn back on.
Oh wow, I guess it is a little warm in here. Did you have a question?
Yeah, do you think Verlis will sign on to the new aquaculture label?
Stewardship Council?
Yeah.
The ASC? Yes, I was going to get to that, but we've already committed to that. We've committed to be one of the first salmon farmers to be certified, and actually a lot of our principles and how we raise our salmon are guided by their 165 criteria, and we've participated in the dialogues as well. So, and they do have one of their criteria is specifically about fish in, fish out, and they have a very specific way of calculating it, and that's the way we use. That's the calculation we use. It's from a gentleman, Albert Tacone, in San Diego. He developed the approach. And so you'll see there's actually, when we get to the certifications discussion, there are so many different certifications out there right now, and there's no standardization. And we've been really wishing the ASC would have come online a little faster. Unfortunately, it's taken 8 years or 7 years to develop the criteria, and they're not quite available for application or use yet. In the salmon industry, they are for tilapia and other things, but very, very closely aligned with them. And really hope to see that succeed. I think our concern at this point is once they get the standard out there, will the retailers even care or will the market care? I mean, it's great for us to be certified, but does it mean anything at the end of the day? Will it help, promote the product, which then means we can grow and actually convert more of the industry? Because the intention is to get the innovation. I think their intention is to have 15 to 20% of the industry get certified to encourage the innovation down with the rest of the industry. Yeah.
I'm curious, one of the articles you read in advance of your talk talked about the fact that Whole Foods won't source Verlis salmon.
Yes.
Because of the genetically engineered piece.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you've been in discussions with them, how they justify that and whether you expect that to change.
Well, this is a big unknown. I was talking to Erin about this a little bit earlier. So I was not the one in the discussion, and but we have had multiple discussions with them. We actually had a huge advocate buyer inside Whole Foods who was ready to bring us on, and she kind of got shut down. Their comment is really on the GM yeast. They really don't want to support that today. I have questions around, their probably 50% of their products have some genetically modified ingredients in them, which I'm curious to see. Now they're promoting the labeling, which is great. I support labeling as well, but so how does that highlight those products and ingredients in their food? And I'm not sure why they were so resistant to bringing us on, given that they do have so many products with ingredients in their foods already. So I think it's a matter of time, and I'm hoping that there'll be some opening of discussion there, and I'll talk a little bit about why I believe so from an NGO perspective. We've been, he mentioned the ASC. The ASC was founded by the World Wildlife Fund. We've been very close with them for the last 8 years, in just from the very beginning of how do we develop this yeast, all the way to the Monterey Bay Aquarium doing a 9-month assessment of our farms right now, and been very involved in understanding our antibiotics use and our veterinarian records and talking to the regulatory bodies and monitoring our diet and our feed and getting pretty close to being getting a recommended buy from them. So I'm curious how you have these two different discussions going on where you actually see the environmental community seeing this as a good solution. versus Whole Foods taking a different path, and what the consumer will do too, because I think right now they're looking to both of them to help guide their decisions. And how will this play out? I have no idea. So I guess, does that kind of answer it? I don't know. You know, Whole Foods is Whole Foods. I think, you know, perhaps they're in a leading position now, and there's a lot more for them to lose than there was, you know, when they first started off, and they were much, I think, in some ways more innovative. But a lot of folks we work with are their competition, and some of the more smaller independent shops that feel like they can take this kind of risk. So, how am I doing on time, by the way? Okay. This is a good lead-in. When we first came up with the yeast, instead of going out and just saying, hey, this is a great solution, we actually had to test it. So we brought in 7 NGOs. We brought in EDF and Physicians for Social Responsibility and WWF and the Pew Charitable Trust and Friends of the Ocean and all these different groups, and said, hey, we've got this solution. We believe it's a great solution for the aquaculture industry, and this is why. What do you think? This was like 7 or 8 years ago. And they gave their feedback. We asked them, what are your concerns about having a genetically modified yeast used in this manner? They gave their feedback around that. And what this allowed us to do is to modify our process and how we made the yeast to address their concerns in a way that this is a closed containment produced yeast. So it's made in a closed containment, and there's nothing left living in the environment once we're done with the process. And so that was one of their biggest concerns was, I don't know if you think about GMO crops, one of the big concerns is what happens when you release into the environment. It takes over organic farms, or it takes on a life of its own. We mitigated that risk by creating a closed loop system, and it actually dies at the end of the process. And it needs, I think, vitamin B to continue. And so unless you feed it vitamin B, it stops living. So that was really important in our long-term strategy, because the folks that we engaged 7, 8 years ago, before we even started talking to AquaChile, are now still our friends, because we involved them so early on in the process to talk about how do we, use this technology in a way that you would feel comfortable with. Then the second test was the fish. We had to see, how does it impact the fish? So we ran a number of fish lab tests at various stages in their life cycle to understand how does this impact growth rates, how does it impact mortality, how does it impact disease, how does it impact the fillet, the composition, and at the end of the day, the taste. We actually didn't know if the taste was going to change, and so that was an important component as well. Luckily for us, people actually really like the taste, and it is unique and different, and people find it to be a more enjoyable experience, so that was a benefit that we got added on. And then at the end of the day, the final tests were the salmon going to eat it? They're really, really sensitive creatures, and so we didn't know if they were going to consume the yeast or not, and had to make sure that that they were going to be healthy and thrive on the feed. So we did try to take as many precautions as possible, and try to bring in the experts from both the health and the nutrition side to understand what those concerns would be. And we continue to commit to the testing and understanding of how this is impacting our salmon. We believe today that we have lower mortality rates. We believe we need less antibiotics. We don't have enough data to back it up, but our initial hypotheses and the initial data, I would say we've been in the water for 2.5 years, and we've had fish in the market for 1 year, but we need to gather some more data to really verify and confirm these hypotheses that we've developed. But there's a number of benefits to the yeast beyond just the omega-3s. Convincing the end user, that's the next line of work that had to happen. So conducting research to understand what the consumers care about, what they value, what they're willing to pay more for. Providing them with the holistic solution, not just solving one of the problems. If you talk to various consumers across the country, how do you define sustainable seafood? It's always different. They have different issues. You talk to the West Coast, they're all about protecting their wild salmon. You talk to the East Coast, it's all about, well, what about me? The health benefits for me, antibiotics, these omega-3s. It's a really different perspective. I'm from the West Coast, I live on the East Coast, I've seen all the perspectives, but we can't be one answer. We have to be everything to everyone. And then that adds on the complexity of how do you communicate that, because depending on who you're talking to, you have to have a very different discussion. Very, very different. Created value with differentiation, and now we're trying to capture it with brand. It's really hard. Trying to create a brand in a non-branded industry, trying to convince retailers to brand your fish in their fish counter. They're like, but you make the rest of my fish look bad. You know, you've taken my entire portfolio and making 95% of it look bad just so you can look good, and it's not going to work for me. So how do you help them get comfortable with the idea? How do you educate their staff enough to differentiate yourself and to tell the story? What kinds of support can you provide to them? How can you use influencers and stakeholders to help tell your story? That's both on the environmental and the culinary side. And then finally, transparency, transparency, transparency. This industry is well known for not telling anyone anything until it's too late. And they get really, people are just frustrated with it and fed up with it. Our goal is to be as open as we possibly can. We try to address everyone's concerns. We have consumers that write to their grocery stores about our yeast or write to them about our feed. Our customer will forward us that letter. We'll call them up. We'll just call them up and talk to them. Now, over time, as we have more and more of those, we probably can't talk to every single consumer who is having a concern. But hopefully by then, our newsletters and our blogs and our online discussion and the media coverage we will have will at least address their biggest concerns, and then we can begin to work on what's the next in that play. So, did you have a question?
I'm wondering about the conversation with the Western who want to keep wild salmon in supermarket. I mean, how does that go when you're coming from the perspective of farm salmon?
Well, so just to get a little caveat, I was a wild salmon only girl, West Coast girl, forever. And my partner was too, and he's recently been convinced that now he will only eat Verlasso if it's farmed, but he won't eat any other farm salmon. But in terms of wild salmon,
I probably was pretty pivotal to the
well, not necessarily. It took me a while because I was pretty anti-farmed. But I think we went to Portland. We went to New York first, and Portland was our second market. We were like, let's go to the mouth of the wolves and just really get the feedback we need to get. And surprisingly, we were really well accepted. I think they had just never seen an alternative that met any of their criteria or even were considered, worth trying. A lot of it was perception on taste, so we had to do a lot of tastings and just get them to try it. And then they recognized that I was talking a little bit about the taste. Because we're a leaner salmon, it's actually meatier. We're only about 12% fat content. Wild salmon's about 8 to 10. Traditionally farmed is 18 to 24. So it's a very big difference, and our texture is closer to wild. So you have this meatier flavor, and people actually associate us closer to wild. So that's been a huge benefit. But then the other thing is we're farming in Patagonia. Some of the biggest concerns about wild salmon is the interaction between farmed and wild salmon, the disease transfer. That video I shared with you guys where the wild salmon runs, they were complaining about all the farmed salmon. Well, guess what? Patagonia doesn't have any wild salmon. So that's one big thing we get to say. And if you think about the West Coast, they actually have a pretty positive association with Patagonia because of the wonderful clothing line. But they think of these beautiful places, and that is where we're farming. So that's a positive thing, too. They're far away from their precious wild salmon. And 3, there aren't local wild salmon that they're infringing on. So that was some of the hurdles we were able to overcome. There's still some concerns about introducing a non-native species and all these things that, of course, everyone brings up and we recognize, but there are some benefits to being down there. And so that's been the advantage at Portland. And then I would say San Francisco is becoming one of our largest markets, and I think that I'm hoping with the Monterey Bay aquarium discussion, it's going to become even a larger market. So. All right, our story is complex. How do we make it personal and relevant to our many audiences? So I've talked a little bit about some of the things we've done and strategies we've done around communicating our value to the marketing or in the marketplace. But we really sort of focused on a 3-pronged approach and had to develop comprehensive strategies to engage the influencers, engage the consumers, engage the business partners. Because each of them have different demands and needs and have different questions about what we're doing and why we're doing what we're doing. Influencers were really important on the credibility standpoint for us. We had to get people outside of our business to validate and say that what we were doing was good, why it was good. And this is a long-term strategy for us, particularly on the sustainability or the environmental side. These relationships with NGOs go on for years, and they're not about short-term solutions. It's not about paying them like you might a chef to say, oh, this product's really good. Like you actually, when working with the Monterey Bay Aquarium, they have been in, the Seafood Watch has been in business for, I don't know, 12, 15 years, something like that. And they have had farmed Atlantic salmon on the avoid category that entire time. And all of a sudden now, with working with us, they're considering moving farmed Atlantic salmon out of that category and putting it as a recommended buy, and that's a huge branding risk for them. They've built their entire brand on, you know, knowing exactly what's right and what's wrong. And there's going to be, and they've convinced people, they've not brainwashed, but they have convinced people why they shouldn't buy farmed Atlantic salmon. And now all of a sudden they're going to say, oh, but by the way, this one's okay. And so that's why I think this 9 to 12 month process with them has really been interesting. They're crossing every T and dotting every I. And they ask us for reports like 10 times to make sure we send them the same report. They just like, they're just being incredibly thorough. So that's a long-term strategy for us, and we believe that that will help us not only in the marketplace, but also help us be better, because they're always going to be providing their feedback as well as to what's important. The culinary side, it's a little different market. You know, you've got this really crazy obsession with the Food Network and celebrity chefs, and there's the whole local sustainable movement. And I want to know my farmer. I want to be able to go see Bob down the street, and he has his names for his chickens, and that's really different, and that's great. And I think, you know, I come from that world. It's very comfortable for me, but it's not going to help solve some of the bigger problems. And so we have found that there are certain chefs not interested because of our GM yeast, and we can sit down with them and have a discussion. And at the end of the day, there's probably 3 different paths that they take. One of them are going to say, I don't even want to talk to you. You're using a genetically modified ingredient. Then the next group of people will say, you know, I've seen your farms. I respect what you're doing. You're really trying to do something good, but I can't support you. I respect you. I don't support you. And then the third group is, wow, this is important, and this is actually a good solution to this challenge or to this problem. And some of them have started on the left and are now 18 months later on the right. And so it's an ongoing dialogue for us. But we are engaging folks that are like leaders of, you know, founders of the farm to table movement 30 years ago, folks like John Ash in California, Hugh Atchison, Barton Seaver's a big sustainable seafood person. We're bringing them down to our farms and just educating them and saying, look, this is what we're doing. I don't know if any of you know Barton Seaver, or have heard about him or read about him, but when he came to our farms, he actually ate the feed. Like, that's the kind of guy he is. He's just kind of jumps right in and starts thinking about it. So yeah, I wouldn't even eat the feed, but that's just because there's, you know, it's other stuff that I wouldn't want to eat. And then the health community is something we haven't fully tapped into yet. We do have support for physicians for social responsibility, but we do believe the nutritional commentary is probably a positive one to have at some point. We have an amazing contaminants discussion. I don't know if many of you have paid attention to the argument against farm salmon because of PCBs. That was really big about 5-6 years ago, and actually EDF really picked up on that, and that was the way they were going to convince consumers not to eat PCBs, or not to eat farm salmon. It was because pregnant women and children and the PCB levels. What's nice is that farm salmon down in Chile actually has lower PCB levels than any farm salmon in the world, because no PCBs were manufactured south of the equator. So number one, the waters are cleaner, purer, better. But second, PCBs come into the fish 2 ways. One, from the environments where they're farmed, and 2, through their diet, because they're getting the feeder fish that are growing up in those same environments. So they're getting double hit. By farming in Chile, we get a double bonus. 1, there's none in the environment, and 2, we have 75% less feeder fish. So that means we're feeding them less, and our yeast is actually super low on the contaminant levels. So our PCB levels are lower than wild fish, wild salmon. And this is something that I would love to tell the world, but man, that's going to be expensive. Just because managing the discussion and telling people, talking about PCBs and opening that can of worms and not having the right support and the credibility and all these things to really get that story out there in a meaningful way that people believe and that doesn't get taken out of context is one of the biggest marketing challenges ever. We're having a hard enough time getting people to understand fish in, fish out, let alone adding this whole other layer of PCBs or contaminants to the discussion. So here again, you think, oh wow, you're doing all these great things and you have all these great benefits, but you can't share them with everyone, and you can't actually sell what you're offering. It's really, you have to be thoughtful and prioritize what's the current message and how are you going to convince people that this is meaningful to them and that it's important for the world. Consumers, This is just our way of categorizing some of our targets. We've done some research. Who's going to think about where their food comes from and why? Who's going to ask the questions about their seafood? So we have, awakening moms really concerned about their children, or, they didn't care about what they consumed, but all of a sudden they have a baby and everything's organic. So it's a whole different, it's a different mindset. Sunbelt bound are those, 50s plus demographic that's all about health and wellness. They're like really living it up the last part of their lives. They're also learning a lot from their children. Their children in their 20s or in their teens are bringing forward these issues and bringing forward the discussions. Yes? Oh my, 2 minutes. Okay, I'm going to move a little faster. And then, Susty guys, and then you have the channel partners. But if you think about what we have to communicate to these two, it's all about them and their needs. All their needs are unique. For these guys, it's what's the business proposition for them? How are you, how is this going to make my business, my seafood counter, drive more traffic? How am I going to grow business? How is it not going to make the rest of my seafood look bad, et cetera, et cetera? So that's really a huge challenge. We talked a little bit about the food movement, but a couple of pictures up there. There's a lot about the precious food movement. I talked about it in the beginning. I'm not yes, I love to dine at wonderful restaurants. I love to experience precious food. But if I go in and work in that space, I'm not going to have a lot of impact and I'm not going to lead a lot of change. So to me, being in this other space is much more interesting and rewarding. Many voices. There's no standardized sustainable salmon eco-label available in the market today. So there's a lot of noise. They don't even all agree on what sustainable salmon means. Like I think 7 or 8 of them are in this group, collaborative group together, and they're going to sit in on our final MBA, Monterey Bay Aquarium review, which is in 3 weeks or 4 weeks, I believe. And they're all going to have a say about the report and the recommendation. But they don't even agree. Like there's, they might agree on like 2 or 3 of the standards, but at the end of the day, they all have different definitions. They all have different priorities. They have different mission statements, and so they're protecting their mission, and they're really trying to go after that. So it's confusing. It's confusing for us to know what's right and what's to listen to. It's confusing for consumers. Who should I be listening to? What should I be paying attention to? And oftentimes they're just going to throw up their hands and say, I don't care. It's too complex. I don't want to deal with it. And so it's a huge challenge for us. And for anyone who's trying to do the right thing in seafood. But it's a pretty interesting conversation, but you see the ASC is up there. Education tools, you've been on our website. We've invested a lot in education tools. We've got videos. Every fish shows up with a gill tag and a QR code. So when you get a fish or a fillet at the store, you can scan the QR code. It takes you to the farm where the fish was harvested. You get to meet the farmer. You get to know how deep the water is, what the temperature is. Get to learn a little bit more about, a little closer to the farm. We can't tell you what date we're harvesting yet, but we are working on that technology. That will be the next thing. But this addresses traceability issues, concerns, but also gives you a little more trust in that this is a Verlasso salmon and that we are doing the right thing. Personalizes it as well. Recipe cards. One thing about seafood is people are scared to cook it. Even if you get them to buy it, or if you get them to think about the right issues, they're like, oh, but I don't know how to cook it. So now we have to teach them how to cook it. It's like, oh my gosh, this is a never-ending sell and a never-ending story that you just have to reach people on so many different levels. And so we've come up with really simple ways to prepare fish. You can see on our website, it's called In the Kitchen. You've got basic techniques, but then also some simple recipes. So this includes the top 10 things to know about our fish, all the sustainability points, and then the recipes at the bottom. We've got a fish wrap that are, there's no packaging in fresh seafood, so we had to find ways to get our messages out there. But these are just a few of things. We have a huge social media campaign, et cetera, a fish counter on our website to help you understand the benefits of the yeast and how many fish you can actually save by eating salmon, whether you're in one person, a family, a whole city, the world. These kinds of things. Current customer map, you were asking about this. We started off, and maybe I should say if people want to go, you should go. And if people want to stay and ask questions, maybe I should just go there. It's almost over. It's fine. It's fine. Why don't we just move to questions, because then if there's still some outstanding stuff, we can address what people care about. You had some questions about distribution.
Yeah.
We initially thought retailers were going to be our route to market. They're much more risk averse though, and so it's been a lot harder to convince them. So then we went to distributors. And distributors are great because they're the ones servicing the chefs, and the chefs are independent. They're willing to try new things. They're all about the latest and greatest. They change their menus weekly. Love to bring it in. So that really worked well for us in the beginning, is just to really start with the regional distribution. So we got these guys, you know, all these folks sort of representing us across the country. But now it's, in order to reach volume targets or to be able to really get out to the consumer, we have to go through the retail arm. And that's where we can really do the education. Because at the chef level, they're changing their menu constantly. So it was a great introduction and a great way to begin getting our brand out there. But at the end of the day, the retail is how we get the broad visibility.
Can I ask a follow-up question to the
Mm-hmm.
retailer thing? Also having to do with your problem that you're encountering where they don't want to devalue 95% of their fish.
I'm just wondering if you looked at the, you know, Kobe beef as a similar thing in meat, where in a butcher's area they're going to have Kobe beef. It seems like it's a similar kind of thing, if not, you know, it's
Yes.
a premium brand. Not necessarily.
We've looked at Nyman Ranch beef and Estancia beef, and we've really tried to mimic that. What's interesting is that the meat buyer is usually different than the seafood buyer, and they operate at very different levels. And so you have to try to convince them that what's working in their meat counter is working really well, and you might want to consider adopting it. There's one grocery store, I won't name it, but we walk in and it probably has some of the most premium products you've ever seen, from coffee to chocolate to produce to, you know, whatever, and their seafood is just crap. Like, it's just incredible. And you're just like, how do you have such different approaches to your different categories in the same store? And they don't think consumers know enough to care. So it's the cheapest option, and it's the biggest profit margin for them. We've had some folks say, I like what you're doing, but I've been growing my seafood counter 18% a year. How are you're going to probably risk that, don't you think? And, you know, it's a constant discussion. So we have to build the business case for each of them based on who their customers are, what their value proposition or promise to their customers are. And it's not easy. It's really not easy. Yeah.
It seems that part of the discussion here is that you're trying to make the point that GM yeast is different than GM other crops. And I'm wondering how that's going, and also, maybe you can't tell us, but you know of GM yeast being used for any other process? Because it seems to me that you do have a chance to persuade people that GM yeast, because it's dead in some way or can be provided in a dead form, and you can grow it in an enclosed, might get away from sort of the general fear that the GM genome is going to get out and change the biosphere in some way.
So, let's see, I have to remember where we started with your questions. I don't know where any GM yeast is being used, but I do know that we see, it's like the official categorization is we are a GMM versus a GMO. And that the GMM is the microorganism that dies versus an organism that's continuing to live. And I know there's a number of GMMs used in yogurts and things like this. I think insulin. I mean, you know, we don't want to associate ourselves with medicine, but there are a number of feed ingredients that people don't even realize. I think rennets for cheese, these kinds of things are all GMMs. So yes, we could highlight that other people are using them, or that there are other ingredients that feed that people want, but I don't know if we'll get enough of people's attention to get that far in the discussion. And that's really what we battle, is how much time will people consider the issues, and how much will they have an emotional reaction versus a logical discussion about it. Because so much about GM right now is the uncertainty and the ambiguity around it, which I completely understand. There is still a lot of uncertainty around it, and there's a lot of mistrust in the industry in general, all very, very, very valid. And so depending on who you're talking to, you're either having an emotional or spiritual discussion or a moral discussion, even in some folks' minds, or you're having a scientific discussion. And if you can get to the scientific discussion, it's more logical. And we do find that when we get people to sit down and listen, you really can make some breakthroughs. And we've done that with a number of organizations like the MBA, like the Chefs Collaborative, and we're trying to target these larger influential groups to help then trickle down to the consumer. It's tough though, it takes a long time. Yeah.
So in the context of like global seafood consumption increasing pretty rapidly, we spoke with John Volpe a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
He was saying salmon has gone from being a feast food to commodity food, like an everyday thing. And so there's that aspect that's occurring. But in your business, you're sort of elevating the higher quality product. How does your brand interact with that fact? Like, is the I don't know if that's clear. Like, is the inevitability of seafood growth increasing, or are you, and you're like tapping into this market and saying like, yeah, this is the way the market's going and we can do it better, or are you saying let's eat less salmon and have it be like higher quality? You know.
No, we're saying consumers are going to eat whatever they want, and therefore we need to provide a better option. There's something like Barton Seaver, his mantra is to introduce people to fish they don't eat. Like he says, let's diversify what we eat. And that's great, but that's only going to go so far, and that will have its own challenges. But right now, salmon, like I said, continues to grow 7 to 10% a year, and we need to find an alternative solution and stop wreaking havoc through the current farming practices. So that's really been our focus area. Again, as I mentioned before, we do want to be a certain size because that helps us reduce the amount of feeder fish taken out of the ocean for the industry and reduce the havoc from the ecosystems and provides a better quality fish. Today we are a significant premium over farm salmon. I would say it depends on where you are, but Fresh Direct in New York carries us, and we're like $12.99 versus $9.99 there. But if you go to the West Coast, we're $16 to $18.99 versus $10 to $12.99. Just depends on who the retailer is and how they mark up things. So people are willing to pay that premium today, but we'll probably, over time we want to bring that cost down by getting cost efficiencies with the yeast and also understanding our practices better and how we can improve them and reduce costs overall, because we're testing a lot of new things right now, and not all of them are going to work out. So hopefully we can then sort of streamline our practices to know what's really important for the salmon's health and the environment. Anyone else? Yeah. And I'm also, I can be here for a while, so if people want to go, feel free.
I'm curious about your risk management strategies, how you test your genetically modified microorganism, and what if there's any physiological effects on the salmon. And you must have a mind for like what kinds of things could go wrong that would look bad with all of the concern over genetically modified organisms. So I'm just curious how you think about that and how you apply science to those questions.
Yeah, so we test our fish more than anyone I know. I know how much. We do sampling constantly, in part because we're trying to measure various things. We're trying to understand the omega-3 levels and the uptake of the omega-3, like how are they processing the yeast in their diet, because they're going to be different depending on various factors, environmental factors, or even the brood stock from where the salmon came from. So we're testing it constantly to understand the health of the salmon. We monitor growth rates, we monitor mortality rates, we monitor disease outbreaks, these kinds of things from a health standpoint of the salmon. We are also running tests on the benthic considerations underneath the farm to see what the changes are in the farm environment. But again, it's all still too new. We've only had 4 farm sites, so we don't have enough information to really understand how this may or may not be different than other situations. We are also currently sharing farm sites with traditionally farmed aquachili salmon still, because we're not big enough to have our own sites. And so there's still going to be a sort of, the data is not going to be clean enough yet for us to truly understand the ecological impact. But that is something we're committed to and working on. In terms of the yeast, we are constantly testing the yeast. I don't know if you guys know DuPont, but they are all about data. Like, they are kind of paralyzed, analysis paralysis, I like to call them. Too much data. And we have a really strong safety and health organization that's really on top of our product stewardship, and we are constantly going through reviews and considerations around the product stability, as well as any sort of other environmental or safety concerns around it. So it's an ongoing discussion and process. I wanted to come back to something you were talking about.